Welcome to Tales Shadow, where the darkness comes alive and stories haunt your every step. Tonight, we take you to the edge of fear, where every whisper carries a chilling secret and every shadow holds a story waiting to be told. Turn down the lights and listen closely, for what's about to unfold might keep you up all night. Are you ready to face the terror that awaits? Let's start this video. Echoes in the quarry. The air that day was thick, unusually so for a summer afternoon. It clung to their skin in a way that made it feel like something heavy was hanging just out of reach. A threat you couldn't quite identify but knew was there. The sunlight, which should have been warm and comforting, had a sharpness to it, as if the world was on the verge of turning something darker. Ryan stood at the edge of the old quarry, staring down at the jagged rocks that filled the pit. His fingers twitched at his sides, uncertain whether to cross his arms or let them hang loosely. It had been years, nearly a decade, since they'd last been here. It was one of those places that had been both an escape and a memory, a place they had come to with reckless abandon, filled with the energy of youth, daring each other to climb higher, to jump further, to face the danger of the deep water below. But now, standing here as an adult, the quarry felt smaller, its edges more oppressive, the very ground beneath his feet too familiar yet unsettling. Katie was the first to speak, her voice an echo of old times, laced with something Ryan couldn't place. I can't believe we're back here. This place, it used to feel so much bigger. It was true. When they had been children, everything had seemed bigger, scarier, more dangerous. Maybe because they had been smaller, maybe because their imaginations had filled the space with things that were never really there. Now, as adults, the rocks didn't seem quite so imposing. The trees were just trees, and the quarry was just a giant hole in the ground. But the chill in the air, the strange weight pressing down on them, told Ryan that something had changed, or maybe it was just them. Maybe the magic that had made this place exciting when they were younger had vanished, and all that was left was a reality of what it had always been, a dangerous hole in the earth, a place to play and forget. "I don't know, Katie," Ryan said, his voice rough with the weight of things. Unsaid, he glanced over his shoulder at Lucas and Sam, who had wandered a little further down the worn path that led to the quarry's edge. They were still in their youth, still caught up in the thrill of revisiting old memories, even if none of them admitted it out loud. "Let's get closer," Lucas said, his usual overconfidence back. He was the one who always pushed them further, always suggesting they go that extra mile, test their limits. He was the first to jump off the ledge, the first to climb the highest trees, and the first to come up with those wild ideas that always seemed dangerous in hindsight, but exhilarating in the moment. Sam just nodded, his gaze flicking between the distant edge of the quarry and his friends, trying to hide the hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Ryan didn't blame him. Sam was the quieter one of the group, the one who always questioned whether their adventures were worth the risks, but who still followed along anyway. It was like he had been born with an invisible line he wouldn't cross, at least not unless someone else was willing to lead him. Katie followed them, and Ryan was left standing at the back, a heavy sense of something wrong creeping in. He could feel it now. Something about the way the trees stood silent at the edges of the quarry there, branches low and heavy, as if they had been watching too long, too quietly. The way the sun seemed to be setting earlier than it should have, casting long shadows that stretched over the rocks like fingers trying to pull them in. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could easily shake off. It felt oppressive as he moved closer to his friends, his feet crunching on the dry ground. He heard the familiar sounds of their laughter echoing off the rock walls, but it sounded distant, like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Something in the air had changed. The quiet hum of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind had disappeared. There was nothing but the crunch of their footsteps and the odd rustle of unseen things in the bushes. "Do you remember when we used to dare each other to jump?" Katie asked, her voice light but with an edge to it. Ryan smiled. "Yeah, and you always chicken out." "I did not," she snapped, but her eyes were smiling, even though there was something else behind them, something Ryan couldn't place. Lucas led the way down the path, stepping carefully over the rocks and debris that littered the ground. "We should check out the old spot," he said, grinning back at them over his shoulder. "It's been years. Maybe we'll find the rope swing still hanging there." "I bet it's gone," Sam muttered, "and probably rotten, even if it is still there." But none of them really wanted to say it out loud. They didn't want to admit that something felt off, that they weren't the same people they had been when they came here as kids. The reckless abandon they had once shared, the wild freedom, had been replaced with the dull weight of adulthood, the worries, the responsibilities, the fears they hadn't known. When they were young and carefree, the quarry had been their playground, their secret. But now, standing at the edge, it seemed less like a place for adventure and more like a place for ghosts. When they reached a ledge that overlooked the deep pit of the quarry, the chill was thicker than before. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't the kind of wind that made you want to take a deep breath. It was cold, biting, the kind of wind that reminded you that something was wrong, that nature itself was whispering a warning. Katie, ever the curious one, leaned over the edge to peer into the quarry. The walls of the pit stretched down into shadow, and she frowned, her fingers gripping the edge of the rock. "I don't see the water," she said, confusion in her voice. "It's gone." Ryan stepped closer to her, his eyes following her gaze. She was right. The deep blue water that had once filled the quarry, the water they had swum in when they were younger, was gone. The pit was empty, dry, and jagged. The rocks at the bottom were sharp and uneven, a dangerous reminder of how quickly things could change. He didn't like it at all. "This isn't right," Ryan murmured under his breath. "What do you mean?" Lucas asked, his voice light but with a hint of concern. "It's a quarry. It's always been a little weird." "No," Ryan said, shaking his head. "This isn't just a little weird. This is different." Katie stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I don't think we should be here." Lucas rolled his eyes, but even he couldn't ignore the unease settling over them. "Come on, it's just a quarry. What's the worst that could happen?" But the words felt wrong as soon as they left his mouth, and the air seemed to grow thicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And that's when they saw it. At first, Ryan thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe his mind, playing games with him. But no, there were shapes in the distance. Shapes that didn't belong. Katie was the first to point them out. "What the hell is that?" Ryan followed her gaze, and his stomach lurched. At first they thought they were statues tall, Imposing figures scattered along the edge of the quarry, like silent sentinels standing guard over the pit. But as they got closer, the shapes began to take form. They weren't statues at all. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. These were people, frozen in time, frozen in grotesque, unnatural positions. Their eyes were wide, staring out into nothing, their mouths open as if caught in a scream that would never escape. Their bodies were twisted and contorted in ways that didn't seem possible, their limbs bent at impossible angles. Some of them had their hands stretched out in front of them, others crouched low as if trying to escape, but none of them moved. None of them blinked. Katie stumbled backward, her hand reaching for Ryan, her breath shallow. "Oh, God, Ryan. What is this?" Ryan couldn't answer. His body was frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. These weren't statues. These were people. People who had disappeared over the years. People who had vanished without a trace, leaving only the faintest whisper of a memory behind. And now they were here, twisted and trapped in the quarry, their frozen faces staring at them as if begging for release. He turned to look at his friends, his voice barely above a whisper. "These are the people who disappeared." Katie looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. You mean, they're..." Ryan swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, they're the ones who never came back. They were taken." Katie's voice broke. How? How are they? What happened to them?" Before Ryan could answer, Sam stepped forward, his face pale, his hands trembling. "This isn't right. We need to leave. Now." But the quarry, it seemed, had other plans. The words, "we need to leave," echoed in the cold air, but it felt like the quarry itself was listening. It was as if the very rocks underfoot had heard Sam's plea and chosen to ignore it. There was no wind now, no rustle of the trees, just an uncomfortable stillness that pressed in around them. It wasn't natural. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, heavy, like the moment right before a thunderstorm breaks. "Sam's right," Ryan said, his voice hoarse as he turned to look back toward the path leading out. He took a step back, then another, his eyes scanning the faces of the frozen figures around them. Something about their eyes, it was like they were pleading with him, calling to him, and the weight of that call hung over him like an anchor. But the path, the one they had just walked down so carelessly moments ago, seemed farther away now. The familiar dirt trail was somehow twisted and darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The small rocks that had once dotted the ground were now more like jagged teeth, forcing them to slow down. Ryan's heart thudded in his chest. The familiar sense of adventure, the one that had urged him and his friends to climb trees, to dare each other to jump, was gone. All that was left now was a gnawing fear he couldn't shake. There was something wrong here, and the quarry wasn't done with them yet. Katie's voice trembled as she spoke again. "We need to go. We need to leave right now." She started to turn, but Lucas didn't move. His feet were planted firm in the ground, his gaze fixed on one of the figures. The man stood there, his body frozen in a twisted stance, his arms reaching outward as if to grab something unseen. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared straight at Lucas, and it was as though the world had gone still just for him. "Lucas," Ryan called, his voice rising with panic. "Come on, man. We have to go." But Lucas didn't respond. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving the figure. "I think I recognize him," Lucas muttered under his breath, as if talking to himself. "I think this is—" "Lucas, no!" Katie shouted, grabbing at his arm, trying to pull him back, but he shrugged her off without a word. The others watched, frozen in place, as Lucas moved closer to the figure. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to follow Lucas with a deliberate slowness. The air around them grew colder with every inch. Lucas closed between them, as if the quarry itself was beginning to pull them in. And then, just as Lucas reached the statue, something in the air changed. There was a crack, loud and sharp, echoing through the quarry, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The wind stilled, the trees stopped swaying. The world held its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, it was gone. Lucas gasped, stumbling back from the figure, his face pale. His eyes were wide, his breath coming in short gasps. "It's him," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "It's really him." Ryan's stomach dropped. "Who? What are you talking about?" Lucas turned, his eyes wide with fear. "This is Steve. He disappeared 10 years ago. He was one of the guys I used to hang out with before he just vanished." His voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air like a confession. Katie's hand flew to her mouth. "That's impossible. That can't be him." But there was no denying the truth. The man in front of them, his body, frozen in terror, was unmistakable. It was Steve, the same Steve who had gone missing all those years ago, the same guy they had once laughed with, hung out with, until the day he simply wasn't there anymore. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry. But how? How is this even possible? He was gone. "I don't know," Lucas said, his voice shaky. "But it's him. I swear it's him." Ryan could see it in his eyes. The same confusion, the same dread. It was like Lucas had recognized something deep inside him, something that tied him to this place. The fear that had hung in the air was no longer just about the quarry or the statues. It was about something deeper, something ancient, something that had been lying in wait, drawing them here for reasons they couldn't understand. The wind suddenly picked up, not gently, but with force, whipping through the trees, making them shudder in their roots. It was as if the very trees themselves were trying to warn them. The air tasted of dust and decay. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, his voice low, urgent. He took another step back, urging the others with his gaze. But Sam, who had been standing off to the side, suddenly froze, his eyes wide with something that looked like horror. He wasn't looking at the figures anymore. He was looking at something else, something moving, something crawling just beneath the surface of the ground. "There's something under the ground," Sam whispered. "I can feel it." Katie, her face pale, turned toward him. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Sam swallowed, his hands shaking. "I don't know. It's like something's crawling under us. Something alive." Ryan felt his heart race. He looked down at the ground, his eyes scanning the earth around him, but there was nothing there, just dust and dried grass. But the feeling in the pit of his stomach, the one that had been gnawing at him since they'd arrived, grew stronger. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And then, as if to confirm his darkest fear, the ground beneath their feet trembled. At first, it was subtle, a vibration, barely noticeable, but enough to make them all pause. Then it came again, stronger this time, a low rumble that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. "Ryan, what's happening?" Katie asked, her voice breaking. Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The ground shook again, this time harder, and they all stumbled, trying to keep their balance. The noise grew louder, a deep, rumbling sound that felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. The statues, the frozen figures that had once seemed like harmless relics, now felt like they were watching them with a cold, unblinking gaze. As the tremors increased, Ryan swore he saw one of the figures twitch, just a small movement, a jerking of its head, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt of panic racing through his veins. "We need to get out of here," Ryan repeated, louder now, his voice strained. Katie, Lucas, and Sam were already backing away, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. The ground trembled again, this time violently, and all of them fell to their knees as the earth seemed to split open in front of them. Ryan turned toward the path, desperate to get out, to escape whatever had awakened beneath the quarry. But as he did, he felt it, the pull, the tug of something, some unseen force that refused to let them leave. Katie screamed as something cold gripped her ankle, yanking her backward toward the edge of the pit. "Help!" she cried, her voice shrill with panic. Ryan dove forward, reaching for her hand, but it was no use. Whatever had hold of her wasn't letting go. "Let go of her!" Ryan shouted, his heart racing, but there was nothing he could do. Katie's face contorted in terror as she was dragged closer to the quarry, her hands reaching out to him. The world around them spun, the tremors growing more intense, the very air shaking with the force of something ancient, something buried deep beneath the earth. Ryan's vision blurred, his body trembling as he reached toward Katie, but it was too late. The last thing he heard was her scream, and then everything went silent. Ryan's heart raced in his chest as the ground beneath him trembled with the kind of force that seemed unnatural. The earth shook violently, as if something deep within the quarry had been awakened from a long slumber. His feet were planted firmly in place, but the pull of terror gripped him, each heartbeat thunderous and erratic in his ears. He had tried to reach Katie, tried to grab her hand and pull her away from whatever force was pulling her toward the edge, but it was as though something more powerful than him was at work, a force beyond reason, beyond understanding. Katie's face twisted in agony, her mouth open in a silent scream, as she was dragged backward with terrifying speed. Ryan could see the panic in her eyes, the desperation, but it was too late. The ground beneath them was beginning to crack, the solid earth splitting open like the jaws of some giant creature ready to swallow them whole. "Katie!" Ryan screamed, his voice raw with fear and helplessness. He lunged forward again, but it was no use. Her body was already being pulled toward the pit, inch by inch, her feet scraping against the dirt as if the earth itself had come alive, devouring her inch by inch. Lucas and Sam were still on their knees, shaking from the tremors that seemed to come from everywhere, from below their feet, from the air itself. They had no idea what to do. None of them did, But as they watched Katie slip closer to the quarry's edge, Ryan saw a flash of something, moving just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the ground shaking. Something was moving, something far deeper, far darker than they had ever imagined. In the moment of sheer panic, Ryan felt a strange sensation like a tug on his very soul, a pull that wanted to drag him down into the quarry with them. It wasn't just the ground beneath him that felt alive. The entire world seemed to be vibrating with an energy, a presence, something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for them all along. "Sam! Lucas!" Ryan shouted, his voice trembling as he fought against the overwhelming force trying to drag him down. "We have to do something. We can't just let her." But even as he spoke, it was as though the words didn't matter. Katie's body jerked, and with a final, horrifying scream, she was gone. One moment she had been there, struggling against the pull, and the next she had disappeared into the chasm below. Ryan froze, his hand still outstretched, his fingers grasping for nothing but empty air. The sound of her scream still echoed in his ears, a haunting reminder of what they had just lost. For a long moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had stopped, as if time itself had decided to take a break from reality. And then, without warning, the earth gave another violent tremor, snapping him back to the present. The ground shook with such force that he was thrown off balance, landing hard on the rocks that lined the edge of the quarry. His mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest as he pushed himself to his feet. "Ryan, we have to go. Now." Sam's voice was panicked, but Ryan barely registered the words. His mind was still reeling from what had just happened. Katie was gone. Just like that. Gone. He turned to Sam, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. What just happened? What the hell was that? "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." Sam's voice was high with fear, and his face was pale, his eyes wide and wild. That was, he broke off, his throat closing up as if the words had stuck in his mouth. Ryan could feel it now, the weight of something dark pressing in around them. The tremors were increasing, becoming more violent, and the earth beneath his feet felt like it was alive, like it was trying to pull them all down into the depths of the quarry. He wanted to run, to get away from this place. But the feeling of something terrible, something ancient, was suffocating him, freezing him in place. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a flurry of leaves spinning through the air. The trees groaned under the pressure there, branches twisting and cracking, as if they, too, were struggling to escape the force that had been awakened. "Lucas!" Ryan shouted, turning to his friend, but Lucas wasn't moving. He was standing still, staring down into the quarry, his face pale, his eyes wide, with something that Ryan couldn't quite read. It was as though Lucas had become paralyzed, caught in the same trance that had gripped him earlier, when he had stared at the frozen figures in the quarry. "Lucas, we need to leave. Now!" Ryan called again, his voice frantic. But Lucas didn't respond. He just stood there, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on something in the depths of the quarry. There was something down there, something that had captured his attention, something that was pulling him in, just as it had pulled Katie. "Lucas, snap out of it," Ryan cried, grabbing his friend's shoulder and shaking him. But it was like shaking a statue, like trying to move something that wasn't really there. Lucas didn't budge. For a moment, Ryan thought about leaving him behind, about running, about saving himself. But he couldn't. He couldn't leave his friend, not after. Everything they had been through together. They had been through too much, and if there was any chance of getting out of here, they had to do it, together. But as he turned to look for Sam, something caught his eye, a shadow moving in the corner of his vision. It wasn't just the wind or the shifting of the trees. No, this was something different, something darker, something that had been lying in wait. Ryan's heart froze. The shadow was moving toward them, and it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, a shape, a person, or something that looked like one, rising from the depths of the quarry. The figure was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was trying to move but couldn't quite manage it. Its limbs stretched out in impossible angles, and its face was twisted, contorted, as if it had been frozen in pain. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. All he could do was watch as the figure climbed from the quarry, its movements more fluid now, as though it had regained some control over its form. "Ryan," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. What is that?" Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't have words for this. He didn't have words for the terror that gripped him, for the way his heart pounded in his chest, for the way his body was frozen in place, rooted to the ground by something far more powerful than fear. The figure reached the top of the quarry, and as it did, the earth seemed to tremble again, but this time it wasn't just the ground beneath their feet. The very air around them seemed to shake, to warp and bend, as though the world itself was being twisted by the presence of the thing that had just emerged. And then, for the first time since they had arrived at the quarry, Ryan heard a voice. It was low, guttural, barely more than a whisper, but it came from everywhere, from the trees, from the rocks, from the very earth beneath their feet. "Leave now." The words echoed in his mind. A voice that was at once familiar and foreign. A voice that seemed to come from the quarry itself, from the very depths of the earth. Ryan's blood ran cold. He turned to Sam, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to go. Now." But it was too late. The figure was moving toward them, its long, twisted limbs reaching out, its face a mask of agony. And as it reached for them, the ground shook once more, and everything went black. The world seemed to warp around Ryan. His body felt like it was frozen in time, every muscle tense, every sense alert, yet none of it felt real. His heart thundered in his chest, the sound deafening, drowning out everything else. It was as though the air itself had thickened, the atmosphere pressing in on him from every side. The figure, whatever it was getting closer. Its movements were disturbingly fluid, no longer jerky and disjointed as before. It moved like something alive now, its long, skeletal limbs stretching out toward them, reaching for them with an unnatural precision. Ryan's eyes darted between it and the crack in the earth where Katie had vanished. The darkness of that hole seemed to pulse, beckoning, waiting. "Sam." Ryan's voice cracked, his throat dry. "Sam, we need to run. Now." Sam didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the figure, his eyes wide, with a kind of hypnotic terror that Ryan could barely comprehend. Sam wasn't just afraid. He was paralyzed, caught in whatever grip the thing had. On them, Ryan turned to Lucas, his eyes desperate. "Lucas, please. We need to go," Ryan said, his voice pleading. He reached out and shook Lucas, his hands gripping his friend's shoulders with raw urgency. Lucas blinked, his eyes clearing from whatever trance had gripped him earlier. But instead of running, instead of helping, Lucas looked at Ryan with a strange, distant expression. It was as if the life had drained from his face, leaving only a shell, a hollow version of the person he used to be. "Lucas?" Ryan's voice wavered. "What's going on?" Lucas didn't answer right away. His lips moved, but no sound came. He just stared at the approaching figure, as though waiting for something, as if he had accepted that there was no escape. "They're here," Lucas muttered, his voice hollow, devoid of any emotion. "They've always been here, waiting." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" His mind raced, but no words made sense. "Who?" "The statues," Lucas said, his voice a whisper. "The people who disappeared, they're not just statues. They're all of us, Ryan. We've all been chosen." The words hit Ryan like a slap to the face. Chosen. Chosen for what? To be turned into those lifeless figures, to join the others lost to the quarries. Strange, malignant force? It made no sense, but in his gut, Ryan felt a sickening truth. Something had drawn them here, something far beyond their control, something old, something that had always been there hidden beneath the surface. And as if in response to Lucas' words, the figure reached the edge of the quarry. It towered over them now, its face still contorted, twisted in pain, or perhaps something darker. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out. There was a moment, a brief, terrible moment, when Ryan thought he saw something slithering inside the figure, something that shouldn't have been there. It was as though the figure was more than just a statue. It was more than just flesh. Suddenly, the air around them grew thick with an almost tangible weight, the ground trembling once more as though the very earth was rebelling against its own existence. The trees around the quarry began to sway violently, their roots ripping free from the soil as if trying to escape. Ryan's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the air itself had become too heavy to bear, as though some invisible force had rooted him in place, trapping him. The figure reached for Sam first, its long fingers, each one too long, too thin, seemed to extend with an unnatural grace. Sam didn't scream. He didn't fight. Instead, he let the figure take him. The moment its fingers wrapped around his arm, Sam's face slackened, his eyes losing their life, his body going limp in its grasp. Ryan could see it happening. Sam's vitality, his spirit, being drained away by whatever force controlled this place. Ryan felt a pang of hopelessness rise in his chest. He had to do something. He had to save them. But the figure turned then, its gaze shifting to Ryan. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty pits of darkness, voids that seemed to swallow everything around them. Ryan's breath came in short gasps, and a cold, gnawing fear crept up his spine. It was as though the figure could see right through him, into his very soul, into the deepest, darkest corners of his mind. It knew everything he had ever been, every mistake, every regret. It was as though the quarry itself was alive, judging them all, passing its verdict on them. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice like gravel like. The scraping of stones against stone. The sound reverberated in Ryan's skull, sending a wave of nausea crashing over him. The figure spoke again, the words slow, deliberate. "You've always been here, always, waiting." The ground trembled again, and Ryan felt the urge to scream, but nothing came out. He wanted to run, to get away from this nightmare, but the words, the figure's voice, had rooted him in place. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. The quarry had been waiting for them. It had always been waiting. Ryan turned to look at Lucas, desperate for any sign of life, of reason, but his friend was gone. Lucas stood motionless, staring at the figure within, expression of quiet surrender. He had accepted his fate, just like Sam. It was as though the life had been drained from him, just like it had been from the others. The figure took another step forward, its eyes fixed on Ryan, and for a moment it felt as though the entire world had stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze, and all that remained was the figure, looming over him, its presence suffocating. "Join us," the figure said, its voice almost kind now, coaxing. "Join the others. It's too late to fight." Ryan's pulse raced, his chest tight with fear. He knew deep down that the figure was right. There was no fighting this, no escape, no hope. But still, despite everything, despite the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume him, Ryan's legs moved. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But he took a step backward, then another, each step more desperate than the last. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, watching him, waiting for him to make his move. And as Ryan stumbled backward, he could hear the faintest sound beneath. The earth, like the whisper of something moving in the darkness. It was as though the quarry itself was closing in around him, its hunger insatiable. Ryan's breath came faster now, each inhale jagged and sharp, each exhale a tremor. He had to escape. He had to run. But it wasn't the figure that terrified him most now. It was the creeping realization that this place, the quarry, the statues, everything, had been waiting for them all along. They were part of it now. There was no escaping. Ryan turned and ran, his heart pounding, his legs like lead. But no matter how fast he moved, no matter how far he ran, the quarry seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows stretched too long, the air too thick. The path he had come down no longer existed. The trees around him seemed to shift, becoming part of the nightmare. The quarry had changed, and so had he. There was no turning back. Ryan ran until his legs gave out. He fell, hitting the ground hard, the breath knocked out of him. And as the world spun around him, as the darkness closed in, he knew that he would never escape. Not from the quarry, not from the statues, not from the thing that waited beneath. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew that Katie, Sam, and Lucas, along with the others who had disappeared, were still here, frozen, waiting for the next person to join them in the cold, unfeeling embrace of the quarry. Forever. Ryan's breath came in ragged gasps as he lay sprawled on the cold ground. His mind spun with the terror of what had just happened, the weight of everything that had been lost. Sam, Lucas, Katie, all gone. There, Fate sealed in this cursed place. And now, it seemed, he was bound to share their grim destiny. The quarry had become a prison, and he was no longer just a visitor. He was part of it now, part of the earth, part of the twisted figures that lined its depths. There was no escaping the truth, no escape from the ancient hunger that had drawn them here. Ryan turned his head, blinking against the darkness that was creeping in, his vision blurred, his limbs numb with exhaustion. He could hear the distant sounds of the earth shifting, groaning beneath him as though the very quarry was alive. The whispering wind carried with it a faint, unnatural melody, a low hum that seemed to echo from the deepest parts of the earth. "Join us!" The voice came again, not from the figure, but from the earth itself. It was the voice of the quarry, old and cold, calling to him, urging him to surrender. "It's too late to fight." Ryan's fingers twitched, his eyes burning with the need to understand. There had to be some way out, some way to break free. But everything around him, the air, the ground, the very rocks, seemed to conspire against him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his body felt like it was made of lead, weighed down by an invisible force. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, to think. His mind raced back to the day they had arrived, to the eerie silence of the quarry, to the strange, lifeless statues that had greeted them. How had they missed the signs? How had they failed to see the truth? The answer came to him then, too late of course, but it was there. The statues. They weren't just statues. They were people. People who had come here just like them. People who had been claimed by the quarry. People who had been transformed into those grotesque figures, frozen in time, waiting for the next soul to join them. And then, in the distance, Ryan saw it. A faint glimmer in the darkness. Something far deeper, hidden beneath the earth's surface. A faint light, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was the only thing that stood apart from the suffocating blackness that surrounded him. Something stirred inside Ryan. A flicker of hope, no matter how small. Perhaps that light held the key. Perhaps it was a way out, a final chance to escape this nightmare before he, too, was consumed. With what little strength he had left, Ryan pushed himself to his feet. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He had to move. He had to find that light. But as he stumbled forward, the ground beneath him trembled again this time with such force that he was thrown to the ground. His head slammed against the rocks, pain exploding through his skull. He barely had time to register the impact before the world around him seemed to collapse. The ground split open, sending a shockwave of force through the quarry, shaking it to its very core. Ryan gasped, his chest tight, as a loud, guttural roar echoed from the depths of the earth. It was the sound of something ancient, something powerful, something beyond his understanding. The quarry itself seemed to come alive, its hunger, its rage, surging toward him. He scrambled to his feet again, his eyes wide with fear, but the path to the light was growing dimmer. The very earth beneath him seemed to twist and shift, as though the quarry itself were reaching for him, pulling him back into its grasp. The statues, those frozen figures, seemed to come alive as, well, their eyes glowed with a faint, eerie light, watching him, waiting for him to join them. And then Ryan saw it. The light was no longer in the distance. It was here, right in front of him. It was coming from the heart of the quarry, from a massive stone pillar that had risen from the depths of the earth. The stone was ancient, weathered, but unmistakably alive. It pulsed with energy, with power, with something that was both terrifying and beautiful. But it was not the light that held his attention. It was the shape at the base of the pillar, a figure standing motionless, as though waiting for him. It was a person, or at least it had been once. The figure was wrapped in tattered clothing, its face obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking who it was. "Katie," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. The figure did not respond. It simply stood there, its hands raised toward the light, as though beckoning him to join her. For a moment, Ryan hesitated. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape, but he couldn't. He had already come too far, and deep down in the pit of his stomach, he knew what had to be done. He stepped forward, his body heavy, his heart pounding. As he drew closer, the figure in front of the pillar shifted, its face revealing the truth of its nature. It was Katie, yes, but she was no longer the girl he had known. Her face was twisted, her eyes hollow, as though something dark had replaced the life that once dwelled there. "Katie?" Ryan said, his voice cracking. "What happened to you?" She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto his. She reached out, her hand stretching toward him, and he felt a strange compulsion to take it, to join her. But something in the back of his mind screamed at him to resist. "Katie, don't please," he whispered. The figure's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, the ground beneath them shook again, and the earth opened wider. The quarry was hungry. The quarry was alive, and it wanted them all. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as the light from the pillar blazed brighter, blinding him. He closed his eyes, feeling the pull of the darkness of the eternal hunger. And then, just as it seemed everything would be swallowed up by the earth, a single, final scream echoed through the quarry. It wasn't Katie's voice. It wasn't anyone he recognized. It was something ancient, something that had been here long before any of them, and would remain long after they were gone. The scream rang out, echoing through the ages as the light consumed them all. The quarry fell silent, the echoes fading into the cold, unfeeling earth. The figures, Katie, Sam, Lucas, Ryan, remained where they had fallen, frozen, in their final moments, no longer living, no longer human. And the quarry, in its infinite hunger, waited. It always waited. Harvest of shadows. The town of Ashton had always been quiet. It was one of those places that time seemed to forget, nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by hills that rose up like the backs of giant, slumbering beasts. The air smelled of fresh-cut hay in the summer and damp earth in the fall. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other by name, where the local diner was a place to gossip, and where the same group of men had been meeting at the bar for decades. But for the last few years, something had changed. Something dark had settled over Ashton like a blanket, smothering the life out of everything. The weather had turned. It started small, a dry season here, a few weeks without rain there, and then it stretched into months, then into years. The crops began to wither. The earth cracked open in long, jagged lines, and the rivers dried up to nothing more than a few puddles clinging to the edges of their banks. The farmers struggled. Even the most seasoned hands, the men and women who had spent their whole lives working the soil, couldn't coax anything out of the land. There was no magic left in the dirt. The corn shriveled up before it could even reach its full height. The wheat turned pale and brittle, and the pumpkins were nothing more than shriveled, rotting husks by the time the harvest should have come. The townspeople talked of leaving, but the idea seemed impossible. Where could they go? This was home. Some held on, clutching to the fading hope that the rains would come. Others, more practical, found new ways to make a living. They started selling their land, turning their homes into little tourist stops for passing cars, or moving into nearby cities where jobs were more plentiful. But even then, the drought followed them. Everyone knew it wasn't just the crops that were dying. It was the town itself. Ashton was fading into nothing. By the time the first signs of change appeared, people had all but given up. The air was thick with the scent of dust and rotting crops. Families gathered in their homes at night, talking in low, fearful voices about what might be coming next. Would the drought last forever? Would they be forced to leave their ancestral homes left to the ravages of time? No one knew, and no one wanted to know. Then one autumn evening, something happened that no one expected. The skies, which had been cloudless for what seemed like an eternity, suddenly grew heavy with clouds. The first raindrops fell, and they came not as a trickle, but in sheets, torrential, unstoppable rain that seemed to wash away everything in its path. The ground, so dry and cracked just hours before, soaked up the water like a sponge. The townspeople watched from their windows, wide-eyed as the fields, filled with the sudden flood of water. They couldn't believe it. After so many years of waiting, the rains had come, and they came in a way they had never seen before. The next morning, the transformation was startling. The fields, which had been nothing but dust and dying crops just hours earlier, were now alive. The corn had shot up in the night, reaching for the sky with stalks that were thick and green, their leaves heavy with the weight of ripening ears. The wheat stood tall, bending in the breeze, golden and promising. Even the pumpkins, which had been nothing more than rotting shells, were now plump and healthy, sitting proud in the rows like they had been carefully tended all year. It was as though the land itself had been reborn. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope in Ashton. The farmers returned to their fields with renewed energy, their hands working the soil as though they could almost feel the land breathing beneath them. They pulled up crops with ease, their barns filling with more produce than they had ever thought possible. The drought was over. The town was alive again. As the days passed, the news spread. Neighbors visited each other's homes to see the bounty that had grown overnight. The streets filled with laughter and excitement as people marveled at the crops, the animals, the sudden burst of life that had descended on the town. There was talk of planting even more crops, of expanding the harvest, of making up for lost time. Some dreamed of selling the surplus, of turning Ashton into a booming agricultural hub. For the first time in years, there was optimism in the air. It seemed as though the good times had come again, but not everyone shared the same sense of wonder. Some of the older folk, the ones who had lived in Ashton for as long as anyone could remember, whispered to each other in the corners of the local diner or behind closed doors. They remembered the old stories, the ones their parents had told them, the ones that had been passed down through generations. They remembered the warnings and they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in their stomachs as they watched. The crops grow so quickly, so abundantly, with no explanation. There were tales old and half forgotten of a time long ago when the town had made a pact with something, something that lived beneath the earth, something ancient. The land had given them life, prosperity, and wealth, but in return it had always taken something back. People, souls. It had been a long time since those stories had been told, and most of the younger generation had long since dismissed them as mere superstition. But for some, those old fears still clung to them like a shadow. As the days turned into weeks, the harvest continued. The fields were now full, the barns packed with the bounty of the land. The townspeople reveled in their good fortune, throwing small celebrations and offering thanks to the heavens above. But all the while, a strange sense of unease lingered in the back of their minds. At night, when the wind howled through the valley, something felt off. It wasn't just the sudden wealth or the speed with which the crops had grown. There was something in the air, a heaviness that hung around the town like a fog. And then the scarecrows began to move. At first, it was easy to dismiss. It was late in the season, and the wind had picked up again. Sometimes the scarecrows, those strange figures dressed in old clothes and stuffed with hay, would shift in the breeze. Their wooden arms would creak, their straw-filled bodies would sway, and their heads would tilt as if they were following the motion of the wind. But after a while, the movement began to feel different. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the breeze. It started with a few, the ones closest to the fields where the crops were the thickest. The scarecrows, which had always been positioned to face the fields, now seemed to be facing the town. Their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, seemed to follow people as they walked past. At first, no one said anything. They chalked it up to nerves. The excitement of the harvest, the stress of a town finally recovering from years of drought. But as the days went on, people began to notice other things. The scarecrows were no longer standing still. Their arms, once frozen in position, were now outstretched. Sometimes, at night, they seemed to shift just a little, moving ever so slightly as though they were trying to reach for something. It wasn't long before the stories started to spread. People would go out at night to check on their fields, and when they came back, they would speak in hushed voices of what they'd seen. A scarecrow turning its head slowly, as though it were alive. A scarecrow standing too straight, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. A scarecrow with its arms raised, as though in some sort of silent plea. But still, no one took it seriously. Who would? It was just a scarecrow, just a silly figure meant to keep the birds away. There was no harm in it, until the disappearances started. It began with the children. Little Timmy Bartlett, who had been playing in the fields when the sun began to set, was the first to vanish. His mother had called for him from the porch, and when he didn't answer, she had gone to search the fields. The only thing she found were muddy footprints leading toward the scarecrows at the edge of the cornfield. But no Timmy, no trace of him anywhere. The town searched high and low. Neighbors rallied together, organizing search parties, calling out Timmy's name into the night. But by morning, there was still no sign of him. His parents were frantic, and the fear in their eyes spread to the rest of the town. Something was wrong. And then, just a few days later, Mabel Jennings, the old widow who lived on the Edge of town disappeared. It wasn't as sudden as Timmy's disappearance, but it was just as mysterious. Her door had been found wide open, the rocking chair on, her porch still gently swaying. Her house was untouched, except for a strange, damp trail of mud that led to the field. It was as if she had walked out of her home into the fields and never returned. The town was on edge now. People locked their doors at night. They avoided the fields and they whispered in corners. Everyone was scared, but the strange thing was that no one ever saw the scarecrows move. They only felt it. They felt it in the air, in the way the breeze shifted through the corn, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Something was coming, something that the people of Ashton weren't prepared for, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for them. As the days wore on, and the people of Ashton began to realize that something far darker was unfolding in their town, the atmosphere changed. What had begun as a celebration of prosperity quickly soured, and the sense of unease that had crept into the hearts of a few grew into a palpable fear that infected everyone. It wasn't just the disappearance of Timmy and Mabel that had unsettled the town. It was the way everything seemed to shift overnight, the way the crops, so lush and vibrant, had been born from the earth with such unnatural speed. And then there were the scarecrows. At first, the movement of the scarecrows was just something that gnawed at the edges of people's consciousness. A quick glance and then a dismissive shrug. But as the days passed, the unease began to deepen. It wasn't just the way their heads seemed to turn when no one was looking, or how their arms swayed like pendulums in the wind. It was something in the air, something more subtle but less real. There was a sense of wrongness that had settled over the town like a thick, choking fog. And the town's leaders, they were just as lost as everyone else. The sheriff, Al Hughes, a man who had lived in Ashton all his life and who had a deep, abiding love for the land, wasn't the type to entertain stories of ghosts or ghouls. He was a practical man, someone who trusted in his boots on the ground and his gun at his hip. But even he couldn't explain what was happening now. Al had been the one to organize the search party after Timmy disappeared. They had combed the fields, calling his name, and they'd found nothing. Not even a trace. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of anything but a trail of muddy footprints that led into the cornfield, and then nothing. No Timmy. The fields stretched out in front of them, silent and empty. The sheriff didn't believe in the old stories, the ones his grandfather used to tell, about the land, about how it had a life of its own, about how the harvest had once been the result of a dark pact made long ago. He dismissed them, of course, old superstitions from a bygone era. But now he wasn't so sure. Something had changed in Ashton. It wasn't just the crops that had come back. So suddenly, it was the people, too. There was a tension in the air, a kind of quiet, dread that no one could shake. At night, the wind howled through the valley, sending whispers across the town, and when the town went to sleep, something else seemed to wake up, something that had been waiting. It wasn't long before the disappearances started piling up. First, it was just Timmy, then Mabel. But after that, it was others, neighbors who had lived on the same block for years, friends who had shared meals and stories. They vanished without a trace. The streets grew quieter, the lights on the porches dimmer. People stopped talking about the crops, stopped celebrating. They became more afraid of the fields than they had ever been. And in the nights that followed, the scarecrows, they seemed to grow more insistent. They weren't just moving anymore, they were watching. Some of the men had gone out into the fields, carrying lanterns and rifles, ready to confront whatever was behind the strange happenings. But what they found was not what they expected. The scarecrows stood in eerie silence, their ragged clothes fluttering in the wind, their wooden arms stiff and unmoving. But then, just as the men approached one of them, an old scarecrow, dressed in a faded checkered shirt and torn jeans, turned its head. Slowly. It wasn't the wind, no. The movement was deliberate, as if it were alive. The men froze, their lanterns swaying in their hands. The light flickered and danced on the scarecrow's face, casting strange shadows across its hollow eyes. The scarecrow's head turned just enough so that its eyes locked onto one of the men, a young farmer named Ethan. Ethan didn't move. His breath caught in his throat as the scarecrow's expression seemed to shift ever so slightly. Its mouth, a crude stitch of twine, seemed to twitch as if forming some kind of silent smile. "Did you see that?" one of the men whispered, his voice shaking with disbelief. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the scarecrow, his heart pounding in his chest. The others turned to look, but by the time they did, the scarecrow was still. Once again, its body frozen in place. For a long moment, no one spoke. They just stared, and then, as if nothing had happened, they slowly backed away, heading back toward the safety of the town. But it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the weather. The scarecrows were moving, and they were watching. Ethan knew it now. He could feel it in his bones. As the days passed, the sense of dread grew. No one knew what to do. They couldn't stay in the town, and they couldn't leave. The scarecrows were everywhere now, standing at the edges of the fields, their hollow eyes following people as they went about their business. At night, the wind would pick up, carrying the sound of creaking wood and rustling straw. And though no one dared to go back into the fields, it was impossible to escape the feeling that the scarecrows were waiting for something. It wasn't just the scarecrows that had changed. The land itself seemed different. The crops, which had grown with such unnatural speed, had begun to rot. The corn stalks, which had been so thick and green just days before, were now brittle and withered, the kernels turning black and shriveled. The wheat had turned sickly, its golden head sagging and covered in strange blotches. Even the pumpkins, once plump and bright, had begun to decay. The land had given them life, but now it was taking it back. No one knew where it all started. The drought, the rain, the sudden burst of crops, the scarecrows, but they all knew one thing. Ashton was no longer the town it had once been. It was a town that had made a deal with something. And now that something was coming to collect, Ashton's people tried to resist. They tried to fight it, but resistance was futile. The town's very foundation had been built on a lie, a pact made in desperation. And now the price had come due. Sheriff Al Hughes, a man who had spent his life in service to his town, was the first to understand what had happened. He had seen the things that no one else had. He had seen the scarecrows move. He had seen the land die in front of his eyes. And he knew that the town couldn't survive this. Not like this. Not anymore. The next night, Sheriff Hughes gathered a group of the bravest men in town. They went out to the fields, armed with lanterns and rifles. But this time they weren't just looking for missing children. They were looking for answers. The field stretched out before them, eerily quiet in the dark. The wind picked up, again rustling the dried leaves and causing the scarecrows to creak and groan. As the men walked deeper into the rows of corn, their footsteps muffled by the dry ground, the silence was almost unbearable. And then they saw it, at the far edge of the field, surrounded by a ring of blackened corn, stood something. It was tall, much taller than any scarecrow they had ever seen. Its face was covered with a burlap sack, its arms long and reaching, like something that had been twisted and bent out of shape. The men stopped their breath, caught in their throats. It wasn't a scarecrow anymore. It was something else. The figure moved, slowly, its head turned toward them, and its hollow eyes, hidden beneath the sack, seemed to pierce through them, as if it could see into their very souls. Sheriff Hughes raised his rifle, but his hands were trembling. He had no idea what they were dealing with, no idea how to fight it, but they had to try. But before they could make a move, the ground beneath them shifted. The earth rumbled, and the scarecrows began to rise one by one from the soil like creatures born from the earth itself. They were no longer just figures in the field. They were something far worse. The harvest had come, and the price would be paid. As the scarecrows emerged from the earth, one by one, Sheriff Al Hughes realized that the figures before them were no longer merely symbolic. They were alive, twisted and grotesque. Their straw-stuffed bodies seemed to writhe as though they had a will of their own. The faint moonlight cast long shadows across their hollow eyes, and the air seemed to grow thick with the scent of decay, old earth, damp straw, and something fouler, something rotten beneath. The men stood frozen, rifles raised, but their hands betrayed them, shaking, trembling as the scarecrows moved closer. Their wooden limbs creaked with every slow, deliberate step. They were coming. It was impossible to ignore. Their eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, were fixed on the group, calculating, waiting for the moment to strike. The earth trembled again, and suddenly the ground beneath them cracked open, as though the land itself were protesting the very existence of their presence. A deep, guttural noise rumbled from the soil, like something waking after a long, cursed slumber. The scarecrows halted, their heads tilting as though listening to the earth beneath them. "Do you hear that?" one of the men whispered, his voice barely a breath above the wind. They all heard it, a low, resonating growl, followed by an unsettling silence. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth, from some dark, forgotten place beneath the town. The scarecrows, once thought of as harmless, relics of harvests past, were now the twisted sentinels of something older, something evil. Sheriff Hughes took a step back, instinctively clutching his rifle tighter. The figure, at the center of the group of scarecrows, taller, darker, more menacing, moved with unnatural grace. Its burlap sack of a face shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if it were grinning at them. There was something deeply unsettling in that motion, a promise of violence, of something ancient awakening to claim its due. "Fall back," Hughes commanded, his voice low but firm. "Get to the town. Get to safety." But the words felt hollow in the air. They didn't feel like commands. They felt like please. He wasn't sure they could make it back to town. The scarecrows were closing in, The dark figure in the center, its arms outstretched, seemed to beckon them forward, drawing them toward the heart of the field like moths to a flame. The men started to retreat, their steps hesitant, unsure. But the more they moved, the more the earth beneath them seemed to shift. The ground was no longer firm. It buckled beneath their boots, like it had become soft and hungry, eager to swallow them whole. And from the edges of the field, the scarecrows began to move faster, their limbs no longer stiff and jerking but fluid, like they were alive, like they were hunting. One of the men, Thomas, a young farmer who had been working the fields for years, broke away from the group. He sprinted toward the woods at the edge of the field, hoping to outrun the madness. But as he ran, something in the corner of his eye caught his attention, a figure, half hidden behind the overgrown corn. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of one, but it wasn't human. Thomas slowed, heart hammering in his chest, as he tried to focus through the haze of fear and desperation. The figure stepped forward, and Thomas felt his breath catch. It was Timmy, but Timmy was dead. Timmy had vanished weeks ago. The boy was standing in the field, his eyes wide and glassy, his face pale and drawn. His clothes were covered in dirt, his hair matted with something dark and sticky, but it was him. It had to be him. Timmy? Thomas choked, his voice raw with disbelief. What happened to you? The boy's mouth opened, and the words that spilled out were not his own. They were deeper, darker, a voice not of this world. The harvest is ready, Timmy said, his voice low and unearthly. The land has been fed. It wants more. Thomas felt the ground beneath him tremble, and for the first time he realized what the scarecrows were. They weren't just sentinels. They were the guardians of something much older, much darker. They were protectors, yes, but not of the land or the town. They were protectors of the harvest, a harvest born from blood, from sacrifice. The crops had not been gifted to them. They had been stolen from the earth, and now the price was being collected. And the price, as they had come to realize too late, was everything. Thomas's scream echoed through the field as the scarecrows closed in on him. The dark figure, Timmy, or whatever was now, reached out with its small, skeletal hands, and the ground beneath Thomas seemed to open up, pulling him into its depths. The others had heard his scream, but by the time they turned back, it was too late. The scarecrows were already upon them. The men tried to fight, tried to shoot, but the bullets passed through the scarecrows like they were made of smoke. They were untouchable, their bodies impervious to harm. The rifles were useless against them. The sheriff didn't know how long he'd been running. Minutes, hours maybe, even days. Time had become a blur in the face of the horrors they were witnessing. When he finally made it back to the town, he barely recognized it. Ashton had become a graveyard. The streets were empty, the houses dark and lifeless. The once bustling town square was now silent, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the dead crops that still clung to life. It felt as if the very air had turned to dust. Hughes stumbled into the church, where a handful of survivors had gathered. They huddled in the pews, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. There was no talking, no comforting words. They knew what had happened. They knew the town was lost. One of the older men, a former farmer who had lived in Ashton all his life, looked up at the sheriff. His eyes were hollow, his hands trembling. "They've come," the man whispered. "They've come for us all." Hughes didn't speak. He couldn't. What could he say? The town had been sacrificed, its people doomed from the moment they had welcomed the harvest, from the moment they had allowed the curse to take root. Ashton was no longer the town he had known. It was a shadow of what it had once been, a place where the land had grown hungry, where the harvest had fed something that could not be sated. And now the harvest was complete. The scarecrows, the figures in the fields, had come to collect what they were owed. The land had been fed, but the people had been consumed. The harvest had claimed them all. Sheriff Hughes, standing alone in the ruined church, knew there was no escape. No one was coming to save them. The curse of Ashton had been sealed long ago, and now it was too late for anything but darkness. The scarecrows were waiting, as they always had been, and the harvest would never end. Static screams. It was one of those afternoons that teeter between summer and fall, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sleepy town of Pine Hill. The air was heavy with the scent of dry leaves, and the wind whispered through the branches, like an old man telling secrets he couldn't remember. 16-year-old Ben Walker sat on the front porch of his house, flipping through an old comic book he'd found at a garage sale earlier in the week. His fingers traced the edges of the pages, worn and curled from years of being read by hands more eager than his. He wasn't really reading, though. His eyes kept wandering to the woods across the street, where the trees seemed to sway too rhythmically, as if something unseen was moving within them. Ben had always been a little different. The other kids at school called him weird behind his back, but Ben didn't care. He was used to it. Ever since his father had died in a car accident when he was 9, Ben had spent more time alone than most kids his age. His mom did her best, but there were only so many hours in the day. And besides, Ben didn't mind being alone. It gave him time to think, to observe. That afternoon, though, he wasn't thinking about his dad or the kids at school. His mind kept returning to the radio he'd found that morning. It had been sitting there on the shelf in the old thrift store, tucked behind dusty boxes of knickknacks. The radio looked ancient wooden, with a faded brass dial and 2 large knobs on either side. It was an old AM/FM radio, the kind his grandfather might have used, though it was much older than anything he'd ever seen before. The price tag had been cheap, just a few bucks, and Ben, curious about the strange hum it seemed to give off, decided to buy it. At first, the radio didn't seem anything special. It crackled when he plugged it in a low buzz filling the small bedroom he'd set it up in. Ben adjusted the dial, searching for a station. Static. More static. He sighed, ready to give up, but then something strange happened. A voice. It was barely a whisper, like someone speaking through a long tunnel. But it was there, a soft, warning tone that chilled him despite the warmth of the afternoon. "Ben," it said, "there's danger." Ben froze. His heart thudded in his chest, but he couldn't move. The voice was so clear, so real. He turned the dial again, and the voice faded, replaced by more static. Nothing else. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Ben didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that whisper again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "There's danger." The more he thought about it, the more his mind raced with possibilities. Who or what had spoken to him through the radio? How could it know his name? His room felt colder than it had any right to be, and Ben pulled the blanket tighter around himself, trying to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his vision, waiting for him to turn his head. The radio sat on his desk across the room, silent now, but its presence seemed to weigh on him. It was as if the object itself was watching him, waiting for him to come closer, to turn the dial once more. He shivered and turned over, forcing himself to focus on sleep. When he finally awoke, the sunlight was already streaming through his window, casting golden streaks across the floor. Ben rubbed his eyes and sat up, blinking. In the morning light, the radio was still there, untouched from the night before. He had half expected it to be gone, or at least moved like something out of a nightmare, but it remained in place, as if mocking him for his fears. The voices, though, were gone, at least for now. Ben grabbed his backpack and headed out to school, pushing the strange thoughts from his mind. He needed to focus. He couldn't let his imagination get the best of him. But as he walked to the front door of Pine Hill High, something felt off. The air felt thick, heavier than usual. The sound of lockers opening and closing seemed too loud, the chatter of his classmates too sharp. When Ben passed by Jason Tucker, the quarterback, he heard something strange. "Don't talk to him. He's dangerous." The words weren't spoken out loud, not by Jason. No, the voice had come from somewhere else, from the static between the noises of the hallway. Ben stopped, in his tracks, heart pounding. Jason didn't seem to notice, his eyes trained on his phone screen. But Ben's mind was already reeling. The voice, it was the same one, the one from the radio, the one that had warned him of danger. He shook his head, pushing past the unsettling feeling and making his way to homeroom. The day passed in a blur. His thoughts kept returning to the radio, to the warning. Was it a coincidence that the voice had spoken to him again, or was it something more? Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening in Pine Hill, something he wasn't supposed to understand. As the bell rang to signal the end of the school day, Ben hurried home. He needed answers. He needed to know what was going on with that damn radio. Once he got to his room, he wasted no time. Ben plugged the radio in again, his fingers trembling as he reached for the dial. For a moment, nothing happened. The static filled the room, a soft, crackling hum that made his skin crawl. And then, just as before, he heard it. "Ben," the voice whispered, its tone more urgent this time. "They know you're listening." The blood in his veins turned to ice. He stared at the radio, unsure of what to do. Was it some kind of prank? Was he losing his mind? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't expect an answer, but the air seemed to pulse around him, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The voice returned, this time clearer than before, almost like it was standing next to him. "You need to leave Pine Hill. They will come for you. You're already in danger." Ben's stomach dropped. Who's coming for me?" The radio hissed, static filling the room again. There was no answer. His head was spinning. Ben turned the dial again, desperate to make sense of what was happening. The words "leave Pine Hill" kept repeating in his mind, echoing in a way that felt too real, too urgent to ignore. But before he could adjust the dial any further, the radio let out a high-pitched screech, and the voice came back. This time, it was louder, almost frantic. "Ben, they know your secrets." His pulse quickened. What did the voice mean by that? Ben's mind raced as he thought back to everything he'd ever done in Pine Hill. Every secret, every lie, everything he'd tried to forget. But nothing stood out. Nothing felt like it was worth revealing. He was a typical teenager. Nothing special. Sure, he didn't have many friends, and he was still processing the loss of his dad. But that wasn't enough for someone to want to hurt him, right? The radio crackled again, this time in short bursts, as if struggling to find something to say. And then, out of nowhere, the voice, now deep and unsettling, spoke again. "You've been careless, Ben. They know everything. Your darkest thoughts, your smallest actions, the things you think you've hidden, the things you want to forget. They are all known." Ben staggered back from the radio as if it had just slapped him. His breath was shallow, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Suddenly, the door to his room creaked open, and his mom stood there in the doorway, looking at him with concern. "Ben, what's going on in here? You've been acting strange all day." Ben didn't know how to answer. He couldn't tell her about the voices, about the radio, about the secrets it was threatening to expose. She wouldn't understand. But something told him, deep in his gut, that he couldn't stay in Pine Hill. Not anymore. Ben didn't sleep that night. The voice, the warnings, the things that knew his mind, was too crowded with questions to even consider closing his eyes. He stayed in his room, staring at the radio, waiting for it to speak again. But the silence that followed was suffocating, and it gnawed at him. The next morning, he left for school in a daze, his mind still tangled in the cryptic messages the radio had sent him. His mom had given him a worried look at breakfast, but he hadn't told her anything. He couldn't. What could he say? That a mysterious voice from a radio was warning him about something he didn't understand. She'd think he was losing it, or worse, she'd get scared. School was a blur. Everyone around him seemed so normal, laughing, talking, oblivious to the strange weight that pressed down on him. But Ben knew better. He knew that something was wrong in Pine Hill, something that was hiding just beneath the surface, something that was waiting to be uncovered. At lunch, Ben sat at his usual spot alone. He was used to it by now, but as he pulled out his sandwich, something strange happened. Jason Tucker, the same quarterback who had passed by him the day before, suddenly slid into the seat across from him. Ben looked up, confused. Jason rarely paid attention to him, let alone talk to him. "What's up, man?" Jason said, his voice flat, as if he had been waiting to say those words for a long time. Ben raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Jason glanced around, as though checking for eavesdroppers. Then he leaned in, his face serious. "You need to get out of Pine Hill, dude." The words hit Ben like a slap. His mouth went dry, and his pulse quickened. The same warning from the radio. It was happening again. "What are you talking about?" Ben's voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Jason leaned back, a strange look in his eyes. They know about you. They've been watching, waiting." He paused, as though considering how much to say. The radio, it's not just picking up voices. It's letting them in. Ben stared at him, his mind struggling to process the words. "What are you?" Talking about? What do you mean letting them in? Jason's expression hardened. It's like the town itself is infected. People here are... He hesitated, then shook his head. You've got to get out. If you don't, they'll come for you too. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave, to get as far away as possible. But something deep inside told him he couldn't. Leave, not yet. He had to understand what was happening. He had to figure out who or what was behind all of this. I don't know what's going on, Ben said, his voice barely audible. But I'm not leaving. Not until I get some answers. Jason stood up abruptly, his face contorting with frustration. You don't get it, man. It's not up to you. They'll find you. They'll make sure you know what they want you to know. And then Jason stopped, his voice trailing off. He turned and walked away without another word. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that Jason was right. Something was happening. Something far bigger than the radio. Something connected to Pine Hill itself. But what? That afternoon, Ben returned home, determined to get answers. He couldn't just sit around waiting for things to unravel on their own. He rushed upstairs to his room, his mind racing. He grabbed the radio and plugged it in again, hands shaking. The silence in the room was deafening. He spun the dial, hoping for something, anything, but all he got was the static. Just like the night before. And then, just as he was about to give up, the voice came through again. Ben, he froze. His heart raced. Ben, they're coming. You need to leave. The voice was more urgent now, almost frantic. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Who? Who's coming? But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the radio emitted a loud screech, followed by another burst of static. Ben's hands trembled as he turned the dial again, trying to find the voice, trying to get some answers. But this time, the static was louder, more erratic, as if the radio was struggling to stay connected to something or someone. And then, suddenly, the radio went dead. Ben stared at the blank screen. The air around him felt charged, like the calm before a storm. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the radio, before something caught his eye. The window was open, and a breeze had started to blow in. It rustled the curtains. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was a shadow moving outside his window. Ben jumped to his feet, his pulse racing. He moved closer to the window, peering out into the fading light of the evening. The shadow was gone, but he was sure. He had seen something. Then a low, bone-chilling whisper echoed through the room. Ben, they know. Ben spun around, his heart in his throat, but the room was empty. The radio was still silent. A knock at the door made him jump. His mom's voice came through the wood. Ben, are you okay? You've been in there all evening. Ben didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was too full, too overwhelmed by the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He glanced at the radio once more, but before he could move, the whispers started again. This time, they weren't just warning him. They were revealing everything. They know everything about you, Ben. Your fears, your mistakes, your secrets. The truth is, the voice paused, its tone darker now, almost sinister. The truth is, Pine Hill is alive, and it's hungry. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The radio crackled again, but this time the static wasn't just noise. It felt almost deliberate, like the town itself was breathing. Through the speakers, the voice that followed was no longer a warning. It was a command, chilling in its authority. Pine Hill is alive, and it's hungry. Ben's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his hands clutching his head as, though the words themselves were physically crushing him. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in, pressing him toward the radio. He had to get out. He wasn't sure how, but he knew Pine Hill itself was part of this. It wasn't just the radio, it was everything. The town, the people, the woods that crept up to the edge of his neighborhood, the quiet streets that seemed too still, too silent. The whispers from the radio began again, growing louder, overlapping, until it felt like 1,000 voices were speaking at once, all directed at him. They know everything about you, Ben. The voices echoed. Your fears, your mistakes, your secrets. You can't run from us. The chill of realization swept over him, and Ben suddenly understood. The radio hadn't just been transmitting voices from another dimension or a far-off world. It had been a doorway, a conduit that allowed whatever was lurking in Pine Hill to peer into his life. And it wasn't just Ben, it was every single person who lived here. The town itself was feeding on their fears, their secrets, and it knew everything. He had to stop it. But how? Ben's eyes darted around the room, his mind scrambling. There had to be something in this place that could help him understand what was happening. He needed answers. And the radio was his only connection to whatever was pulling. The strings in Pine Hill. He grabbed the radio and turned the dial again, desperation clouding his judgment. The static shrieked, and then the voice returned, even darker than before. You think you can stop it, Ben? You think you can escape? Ben clutched the radio tighter, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't know what you are, but I won't let you control me. I won't let you control anyone else. The voice laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that sent a chill down his spine. Control? It's not about control. It's about survival. Pine Hill survives by feeding on its own. It thrives on the darkness inside every one of you. You can't escape. Ben, you're already part of it. Ben's thoughts spun. His dad's accident. The strange disappearances over the years. The unsettling feeling that had always hung in the air just below the surface. Pine Hill was a place built on secrets and fear, and it fed on both. He had to end it. He had to destroy whatever it was that held the town in its grip. The next few days were a blur. Ben stopped attending school. He spent hours poring over old books, digging through articles, trying to find any mention of the town's dark history. And then, hidden deep in the back of an old library book, he found it. Pine Hill had been founded over 100 years ago, but the town had always been shrouded in mystery. There had been stories of strange disappearances, of people losing their minds, of whispers in the wind that carried more than just sound. The town's early settlers had made a pact, something dark and twisted, a pact with whatever force had been living in the woods, a force that thrived on fear and despair. The radio wasn't just a random object, it was a relic of that pact, a way for the town to communicate with the entity that lived within. The land. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Pine Hill was a prison, and the town was its warden. It wasn't just that the people were trapped. The town itself was alive, feeding on their deepest fears. Ben had been chosen, whether by chance or fate to witness it all. And now it wanted him to become part of it. He knew what he had to do. He had to destroy the radio. He had to sever the connection between Pine Hill and whatever darkness held it captive. That night, Ben went to the woods. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows over the twisted trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. His heart thudded in his chest as he made his way to the clearing where the radio had first started speaking to him. The radio was there, perched on a rock at the center of the clearing. Ben's breath caught as he approached it, the static already beginning to fill the air, the whispers starting up again. "You can't stop this, Ben," the voice warned. "You belong to us." Ben reached into his backpack and pulled out the old hammer he'd brought with him. Without hesitation, he lifted it above his head and brought it crashing down. On the radio, the sound of shattering glass and metal echoed through the woods, and for a moment, everything went silent. The wind stopped. The trees stopped rustling. The air grew still, almost suffocating in its silence. And then the whispers returned. But this time they were frantic, desperate. "You've made a mistake. You've set us free." The radio, now destroyed, began to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and Ben's mind was flooded with images, flashes of every dark secret the town had ever held, every hidden fear, every unspoken word, every moment of pain. It was all there, filling his head, overwhelming him. He staggered back, his hands clutching his temples as the visions grew more intense, more unbearable. But then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The woods were silent again. The air felt lighter, like something heavy had been lifted from the earth. The radio lay in pieces on the ground, its power finally extinguished. The town of Pine Hill, which had been alive with darkness, seemed to be holding its breath. Ben didn't wait to see if anything would happen next. He ran. He didn't stop, running until he was out of the woods, out of Pine Hill. Years later, Ben never returned to Pine Hill. He tried to forget the town, to move on with his life, but the memories stayed with him, haunting him in ways he couldn't explain. The whispers never truly left. Every time he saw a radio, every time he heard static, he couldn't help but wonder, had he really destroyed the connection, or had he merely severed it for a time? And as he looked out at the night sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that Pine Hill was still out there, waiting, watching, hungry. The hollow house. The morning in Brooksville was no different from any other. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden hue over the sleepy town as it went about its usual business. The sounds of coffee brewing, newspapers rustling, and the distant hum of engines were a familiar symphony to the residents. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed wrong. But then there was Mr. Garvey. He was an old man, worn thin by the years, and carried in the weight of a lifetime that had already passed. He had no family to speak of, and his dog, a graying terrier named Charlie, was his only companion. Every morning, without fail, Mr. Garvey took Charlie on a walk around the neighborhood. It was a routine that kept him grounded in a world that was moving faster than he liked, a quiet ritual that felt like his last tether to the days when he was young and the world was full of promise. That morning was no different until it was. Mr. Garvey's eyes squinted against the sun as he made his way down Maple Street. Charlie trotted ahead, nose to the ground, sniffing at everything in his path. The walk was uneventful, just the way Mr. Garvey liked it. As he rounded the corner of the street, however, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. There, in the middle of the vacant lot that had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember, was a house, a large, imposing house that hadn't been there the night before. It was a strange thing, something that seemed out of place, a Victorian style monstrosity, tall and narrow, with peeling white paint and a sagging porch that looked like it might collapse with the next strong breeze. Its windows were dark, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Mr. Garvey blinked, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He was no stranger to oddities. In fact, he had seen plenty in his time, but this was different. This wasn't just strange. It was impossible. How could a house just appear overnight? Charlie, oblivious to his owner's confusion, continued his trek down the sidewalk, sniffing and wagging his tail. Mr. Garvey remained still, trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. There had been nothing in that lot just the evening before. A few stray weeds and an old bench were all that had been there, nothing more. But now there was an entire house. He shook his head, convinced that his aging mind had finally begun to fail him. It had to be a trick, right? Perhaps his eyesight was worse than he had thought, or maybe he was just imagining it. But as he took a few cautious steps forward, there was no mistaking what was before him. The house loomed large, casting an eerie shadow over the street. "Charlie!" he called out to his dog, though his voice was shaky. "Charlie, come here." The dog trotted back obediently, but Mr. Garvey was already moving closer to the house. It was as if something was pulling him toward it, an invisible thread that made him forget all sense of caution. He reached the edge of the lot, his eyes never leaving the structure. It didn't belong here, not in this neighborhood. The houses around it were all modern, neat, suburban homes. This one stood out like a sore thumb, something straight out of a different time, a different place. He took a few more steps closer to the front door now. The wood of the porch creaked under his weight, the boards bending with age. The front door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to step inside. His pulse quickened, but curiosity got the better of him. He had to know more. "Charlie, stay." Mr. Garvey spoke to the dog as he pushed the door open slowly. The hinges groaned, protesting the motion. The air that hit him was thick, stagnant, heavy, with the smell of dust and old wood. It was as if the house had been abandoned for years, yet somehow it was perfectly intact. He hesitated, looking back at the street, where everything seemed so normal, so unchanged. And then, with a deep breath, he stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, he felt the air shift. It was colder inside than it had been outside, and the oppressive stillness of the place hit him like a wall. It was too quiet. There were no creaks or whispers, no sounds of life, just a heavy silence pressing down on him. He walked deeper into the house, his shoes tapping softly on the old wooden floor. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Every step he took seemed to echo in the empty space. He looked around, taking in the details of the house. The wallpaper was faded, peeling off in spots, but there was something about the way it clung to the walls, stubbornly holding on to the past. The furniture was covered in sheets, white fabric draped over shapes that once had a life of Their own. He could almost imagine the laughter and chatter that must have filled these rooms long ago. But now it was all dead, still, forgotten. A shiver ran down his spine, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something about this house, something that felt alive. Or perhaps it was just the eerie stillness of it that made his senses feel heightened, like every little sound was magnified. Every shift in the air felt on his skin. Then, as he moved toward what appeared to be a grand staircase, he heard something, a sound, low and indistinct at first, but growing louder the further he ventured into the house. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Someone or something was in the house with him. He froze. His heart hammered in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to leave. But the curiosity, the pull of the house, it held him there, rooted to the spot. The sound grew louder, closer, and then suddenly stopped. Silence again. Complete silence. Mr. Garvey's breath caught in his throat as the door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. He spun around, panic flooding through his veins. The door was locked. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. That's when he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing from the upstairs. They weren't his, and they weren't Charlie's. The morning passed by with no one noticing the house. The residents of Brooksville had their own lives, their own routines, and they never paid much attention to the empty lot by the corner. That is, until the house was gone. Just like that. When they woke up the next day, there was no sign of the house. It had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of its existence. Some of the older folks remembered the strange occurrence, but they chalked it up to a trick of the light, or perhaps some local prankster's idea of a joke. But for Mr. Garvey, it wasn't a joke. He had seen the house, and the feeling, the sense, of something watching him from the shadows, it never left. He couldn't forget the smell, the oppressive silence, or the footsteps he had heard that weren't his own. And most of all, he couldn't forget the feeling of being trapped inside, of being pulled into something far darker than he could ever understand. That evening, another house appeared, but this time it wasn't in a vacant lot. It stood across the street from the bakery, a beautiful house with a wraparound porch and ivy crawling up its stone walls. And again, just like before, it vanished by morning. The town of Brooksville was restless in the days that followed Mr. Garvey's terrifying experience. Whispers spread like wildfire, carried on the wind to every corner of the small town. The story of the house had already become the stuff of local legend. But for those who had been unlucky enough to witness it firsthand, the terror was very real. At first, Mr. Garvey kept quiet about what had happened inside the house, but the weight of his experience grew heavier with every passing day, and the need to tell someone, anyone, began to gnaw at him. He tried to explain it away, telling himself that it had been a trick of the mind, an old man's fading senses playing tricks on him. Yet, deep down, he knew the truth. He had felt the presence inside the house. He had heard the footsteps. He had seen the shadow in the mirror. It was real. Mr. Garvey had never been the type to indulge in wild speculation. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural. He had lived his life grounded in the practical, the tangible. But now, he found himself questioning everything he had. Once believed, the more he thought about the house, the more questions emerged. How could it have appeared so suddenly without warning? How could it have vanished without a trace? And, most chilling of all, who or what had been inside with him? The answers eluded him, leaving him trapped in a spiral of confusion and dread. It wasn't long before other townsfolk began to share their own stories. It started with a few neighbors, each one claiming to have seen the house appear in different locations around town. Sometimes it was on the empty lot by the bakery, other times on the outskirts of town near the old mill. But no matter where it appeared, the results were always the same. The house would vanish by morning, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace of its existence. Broken branches, disturbed earth, or a lingering sense of unease. Among those who dared to venture inside, there were whispers of strange experiences. People spoke of seeing figures in the windows, of hearing whispers in the dark corners, of feeling eyes watching them from the shadows. Some even claimed to have touched the walls, only to have their hands come away cold and damp, as though the house itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. But there was one story that stood out among the rest, the story of Lisa Harper. Lisa was a young woman in her late 20s, a newcomer to Brooksville who had moved to the town just a year prior. She worked as a nurse at the local clinic, and like most of the town, she had heard the rumors about the house. But Lisa wasn't easily scared. She was pragmatic, skeptical of the superstitions that ran rampant in small towns like Brooksville. She didn't believe in ghosts, and she certainly didn't believe in haunted houses. It was late one evening when Lisa found herself walking home from the clinic after a long shift. The streets were empty, the only sound the soft tap of her shoes against the pavement. She passed by the bakery, where the lights were dimmed, and glanced down the road where the old mill stood. And then, as if it were some twisted joke, she saw it. The house. Lisa stopped in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes locked onto the familiar figure of the old Victorian house, standing tall and ominous on the edge of the lot. It hadn't been there the day before. She was sure of it, and yet here it was as though it had always belonged. She took a step forward, her curiosity outweighing the growing unease in her gut. She had to see it up close. She had to know if the rumors were true, if this was really the same house that had been causing such a stir in town. Her footsteps were quiet as she approached the front porch. The door was ajar, just like in Mr. Garvey's account, as though the house itself were beckoning her in. Without thinking, she pushed it open. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The change in the air, thick with tension. The smell of dust and decay overwhelmed her senses, and she could feel the temperature drop, a chill creeping along her spine. It was cold in here, too cold. Lisa hesitated for a moment, but then she pressed on, her determination to uncover the truth driving her deeper into the house. She didn't believe in ghosts after all. She had a logical mind, and she wasn't about to let a few strange occurrences get the best of her. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She walked through the hallway, her eyes scanning the dark corners, looking for anything that might explain the house's strange appearance. But there was nothing, just the eerie emptiness, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until she reached the stairs that she heard it, a soft whisper just beyond her. Hearing, it was a voice, low and unintelligible, coming from somewhere upstairs. Lisa's pulse quickened. But she refused to let fear control her. She took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. At the top of the stairs, she found a hallway with several doors. The whispering grew, louder, clearer now, but still indecipherable. She pressed her ear to one of the doors, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard someone else moving. Inside, a faint scuffling sound, like footsteps, followed by the rustle of fabric. Her heart began to race as she pushed the door open, only to find the room empty, save for the dust-covered furniture and broken window panes. It was another study, much like the one Mr. Garvey had described, but there was no one there, no one at all. Lisa exhaled a shaky breath and backed away, her mind racing. What had she heard? What had been in that room? Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that sent her stumbling. Forward, she spun around in panic, only to find herself face to face with something she hadn't expected. In the reflection of the window, she saw a figure standing just behind her, a shadowy shape, tall and distorted, as if it were made of darkness itself. Its eyes glowed, faintly, like two pinpricks of light in an endless void. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. She turned back to the window and found the reflection was gone. The air seemed to hum, as if the house itself were alive, holding its breath, waiting. Without thinking, Lisa bolted from the room, her footsteps a frantic clamor against the floorboards. She didn't dare look back as she ran down the stairs and out the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the air shift. It was heavier now, thicker, as though the house was following her. She didn't look back until she reached the street, where the light of the lamppost illuminated the vacant lot. The house was gone, just like that, vanished. Lisa stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She couldn't explain what had happened, what she had seen. It was as if the house had never been there at all, just a figment of her imagination. And yet she knew the truth. Something was wrong with that house. She told no one of her experience. No one would believe her, not after all the stories that had come before. But she knew, deep down, that the house would return. And when it did, it would be waiting for her. As the days passed, the house continued to appear in random locations around Brooksville, always vanishing by morning. The townspeople began to grow restless, but no one dared to enter. The fear had taken root deep in the heart of the town, and it wasn't just the house that had changed them. It was the presence inside. People began to speak in hushed voices, their eyes darting nervously at the shadows. Something was inside that house, something that wasn't human. Those who had gone in had not returned the same. Some came back with hollow eyes, others never came back at all. And then one night, the house appeared again, this time in the middle of the town square. It loomed large and dark, its windows empty and waiting. No one dared enter. No one except for one person, Mr. Garvey. He had spent months fighting the memory of what had happened, but now, with the house standing there in the middle of town, he knew he had no choice. He had to know what was inside. He had to confront the darkness. Mr. Garvey stepped forward, his hands trembling. The door creaked open and he stepped inside. For the first time in years, he was not afraid. The house had called to him, and he had answered But as the door slammed shut behind him, he knew that he was not leaving. Not ever. The last stop. It was just past midnight when Marcus stood alone at the bus stop, the cold. Air seeping through his jacket like icy fingers. The street, bathed in a dim, yellow light from flickering street lamps, was eerily silent. It was as if the city had swallowed its noise and left nothing behind but the faint hum of distant traffic. There were no cars, no pedestrians, nothing but the occasional gust of wind that rustled the fallen leaves along the sidewalk. It was the kind of night where even the wind felt unnatural, too quiet, too still. Marcus glanced at his watch. 12:05 a.m. He didn't know why he was still out here. He wasn't waiting for any bus in particular. He didn't have anywhere to be, or at least not anymore. The world felt like it had gone on without him, like the noise and chaos of life had moved on and he had been left behind, lingering on the edge of it. He had been wandering aimlessly for weeks, unable to find a way out of his own mind. He had tried everything, late-night walks, endless cups of coffee, even getting lost in his thoughts. But the restlessness never left. The unease gnawed at him from the inside out. And then the bus appeared. It wasn't like the others. This one wasn't the usual city transit bus with bright advertisements plastered on the side, nor was it a sleek, modern vehicle. No! This bus looked ancient, old, faded, and worn. The headlights cut through the fog that had begun to settle on the streets like the eyes of some lost, ancient creature. It didn't have the usual signboard listing the route either. There was only a single, barely legible number, Route 66. It wasn't the number that caught his attention, though. It was the bus itself. It seemed out of place. He had never seen it before, not in all his years living here. And yet, as it rolled to a stop in front of him, it felt like it had been waiting for him. A strange feeling of inevitability settled on his chest. The door opened with a hiss, and a man in a faded, gray suit stood in the doorway, his face pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. His eyes were hollow, dark circles beneath them, like someone who hadn't slept in years. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. There was something in his gaze, something empty, as though words weren't necessary anymore. The man just motioned for Marcus to board. Marcus hesitated for a moment, but the odd pull of the bus, the quiet, oppressive sense of something beyond his control, drove him forward. Without a word, he climbed aboard. Inside, the bus was far worse than he had imagined. The air was thick, stale, as though it had been trapped inside for decades. The smell was faintly musty, a mixture of old leather and mildew. The lights flickered intermittently, casting strange, shifting shadows across the interior. The seats were battered and worn, their leather cracked and peeling. Some were torn at the seams, the stuffing poking out in jagged clumps. It was the kind of bus that made you wonder who would still be willing to ride it. But the strangest thing was the passengers. There were only a handful of them, all sitting in silence, their eyes vacant, staring straight ahead. The woman in the front row had wild, unkempt hair that cascaded over her face like a veil. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, but they seemed to be staring at something far beyond the bus. The man next to her had a briefcase clutched in his hands, his knuckles white with tension. His face was set in a grim, expressionless line, as though he was waiting for something or someone to arrive. And then there was a girl. She sat in the middle of the bus, alone, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a tattered dress that looked like it had seen better days, the fabric frayed and worn at the edges. She wasn't looking at anyone. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her eyes half-lidded in a way that made her seem distant, like she wasn't fully present. Marcus stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. None of the passengers spoke, none of them moved. It was as though they had all been frozen in time, trapped in some place where the normal rules of the world didn't apply. Taking a deep breath, Marcus moved to the back of the bus and sat down in the nearest empty seat. He tried to shake off the growing unease, telling himself it was just his overactive imagination. After all, it was late and he was tired. But even as he settled into the seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The bus began to move, its engine humming quietly as it glided through the dark streets. It didn't accelerate the way most buses did, but rather it seemed to float, gliding silently over the pavement. The city outside blurred into darkness, and the buildings, the street lights, the familiar landmarks of the neighborhood, they all seemed to disappear, swallowed up by the night. Marcus tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that curled around his chest like a cold hand. He looked out the window, but there was nothing to see. The streets had faded away, leaving only a black void. The headlights of the bus were the only source of light, cutting through the darkness like a knife. He glanced around the bus again. No one had moved. No one had spoken. The woman in the front row still stared straight ahead, her hands clasped in her lap. The man with the briefcase hadn't shifted an inch, his gaze locked on the seat in front of him. The girl in the tattered dress, she hadn't moved either. They were all statues, frozen in place, not acknowledging his presence. Something didn't feel right. A shiver ran down Marcus's spine as the bus continued its silent journey. He couldn't remember when it had started, couldn't remember when the first turn had been taken, or how long he had been on this strange, unmarked route. It felt like time had stopped, like the normal world had been left behind. "Where are we going?" he muttered to himself, half expecting no answer. But he couldn't help it. The question slipped out. Still no one spoke. The man at the front, who seemed to be the driver, didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes were locked straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The bus moved on through the darkness, the road, stretching endlessly before them. Marcus stood up, driven by an inexplicable need to know where they were going. He walked to the front, his footsteps echoing on the old, creaky floor. The man in the gray suit didn't turn, didn't look at him. The bus's low hum was the only sound that filled the air. "Hey," Marcus said again, his voice firmer this time. "Where are we headed?" The driver remained silent, his hands still gripping the wheel, his face unreadable in the dim light. Panic began to rise in Marcus's chest. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. He reached for the door, his hand trembling as he tried to pull the lever. But the door didn't budge. He tried again, pulling harder, but it stayed shut, as if locked from the inside. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The door wouldn't open. The bus was moving, but where? And why couldn't he get off? As he pulled at the handle again, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. The girl in the tattered dress was staring at him. Her eyes had shifted from the floor to him, and there was something in her gaze, something that chilled him to the bone. Her lips parted, and she whispered, barely audible, "You can't leave." Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He looked at her, but she didn't look back. She simply went back to staring at the floor, as if nothing had happened. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't leave. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and the world seemed to spin around him. He wasn't just on a bus. He was trapped. And the more he looked at the other passengers, their unmoving, blank faces, the more he understood. They weren't just traveling. They were stuck. There would be no destination, no stop. There was only the ride. Marcus sat back in his seat, his heart thudding in his chest like a drum. He hadn't wanted to believe it, but now he had no choice. The girl's words were still echoing in his head. "You can't leave." He looked around the bus. Again, the other passengers remained as still as statues, their faces blank and unseeing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all waiting for something, for some signal or moment. But what? The road outside the bus seemed endless, just a stretch of blackness with nothing visible beyond the headlights. It was as if the world had fallen away. The city, the buildings, even the familiar landmarks that had once defined his life, everything had disappeared. There was only the bus now, a vessel adrift in an ocean of dark nothingness. Marcus glanced back at the driver, hoping for some kind of answer. He still hadn't moved, still hadn't said a word. The man's face was a mask of emptiness, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if he was unaware of anything, or perhaps more likely, as if he had forgotten how to acknowledge anything. He turned to the window once more, looking outside at the inky blackness. Beyond the glass, there was nothing. Not a single hint of light, not a single glimmer of life. The bus was alone in this endless void, suspended in some strange place between worlds. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, staring out into the darkness, willing for something to appear, anything, but there was nothing, only that same oppressive silence. He thought about getting up again, maybe approaching the driver, demanding to know what was going on, but the thought quickly faded. His body felt heavy, like the weight of his own fears was pulling him down. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to acknowledge that he was trapped in this place, stuck with these people who didn't seem to care or even notice him. The girl's words still echoed in his mind. "You can't leave." A chill crawled up his spine, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. What did it mean? Was she talking about the bus ride? Or something else? Something darker, something beyond the simple confines of this nightmarish journey? It was then that he noticed something he hadn't before. The woman with the wild hair, the one in the front row, hadn't moved. She hadn't looked at him once since he boarded, but there was something about her now, something different. Her eyes, they were no longer just staring ahead, lost in some place far off. No, now they were watching him. Her gaze felt sharp, cutting through the haze of his own confusion. He could feel her eyes on him, cold and unblinking. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under her stare, but she didn't look away. Instead, her lips curled into the faintest of smiles, a twisted, almost predatory expression that made his stomach churn. He quickly turned his attention back to the window, his hands trembling in his lap. The girl in the tattered dress, the one sitting in the middle of the bus, hadn't moved either. Her eyes were still fixed on the floor, but Marcus could feel her presence. It was as though she, too, was aware of him, watching him from the corner of her eye. Even though her face remained expressionless, he felt trapped. In a physical sense, yes. But more than that, there was a deeper, more sinister feeling gnawing at him. One that told him this wasn't just some bad dream. No, this was real. He was caught in something that defied logic, something that went beyond the ordinary boundaries of time and space. The bus continued on, its wheels humming against the road, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder, how long had they been driving? How long had he been on this bus, with no memory of stops, no sense of time? He looked back at his watch again, though it was a pointless gesture. The numbers were blurry, distorted as if they too had become trapped in this strange limbo. "Where are we going?" he asked, this time louder, his voice trembling. No one responded. Not the driver, not the passengers. No one even seemed to acknowledge that he had spoken. The stillness inside the bus was unbearable. Marcus felt as though he might lose his mind in the silence. He stood up again, his knees weak beneath him, and approached the front of the bus. He reached for the door, lever once more, his fingers slick with sweat, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the door had been sealed shut, locked in place by some unseen force. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Let me out." His own words sounded pathetic in the emptiness of the bus, a pitiful cry against the suffocating silence. The girl's words, "You can't leave," rang in his ears like a curse. The bus continued its endless journey, the road stretching out ahead of them like a dark, never-ending tunnel. The lights of the headlights illuminated only a small patch of the road, the rest of the world swallowed by the black void outside. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence. It was the man with the briefcase. Marcus hadn't seen him move, but there he was, his eyes wide open now, his grip tightening around his case. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a strange weight to it. "You'll never get off," the man said, his eyes locking with Marcus's. Marcus froze, his heart stuttering in his chest. The man's words were like ice, chilling him to the core. He wanted to respond, wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but he couldn't. His throat had gone dry, the words trapped inside him. The man didn't look away. His stare was intense, almost predatory, and there was something in his eyes that Marcus couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear. No, it was something deeper, something more ancient. The look in his eyes was as if he had already accepted his fate. Marcus's mind reeled. How could this be happening? How could they all just sit here, trapped on this bus, without doing anything? Didn't they understand? Didn't they care? But the more he thought about it, the more he began to realize they weren't waiting for anything. They weren't trapped because they didn't know any better. They were accepting it. All of them, sitting motionless, resigned to whatever this journey was. Whatever it had become, he was the only one who was still fighting it. He looked back at the driver. The man in the gray suit hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the road, distant, lost in a place Marcus couldn't reach. He wanted to shout at him, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. And then Out of the corner of his eye, Marcus saw the woman in the front row. She was still watching him, her smile never wavering. Her gaze was cold, calculating, like a predator observing its prey. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. They had all been here before. They had all made this journey over and over again. And now, Marcus was part of it too. He had boarded this bus, this strange, unholy vessel, and there was no getting off. Not now. Not ever. His heart sank as the realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just trapped on this bus. He had become part of it. Part of the cycle, this endless, torturous journey through the dark. The bus was silent again, save for the hum of the engine. The road outside seemed to stretch on forever. No one spoke. No one moved. And Marcus understood then that he was not just a passenger. He was another lost soul, bound to this bus for eternity. The minutes, or maybe hours, stretched on as the bus glided through the void. The world outside had become an endless black ocean. No horizon, no stars, no moon. The only constant was the hum of the engine, the gentle thrum of rubber against asphalt, the faint smell of mildew in the air. Marcus had stopped looking at the clock. Time had lost all meaning. It was as if the bus existed outside of it altogether. He tried again to open the door. He pulled at the lever with all the strength he could muster, his muscles straining, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But it was no use. The door wouldn't open. The windows were sealed too, their glass cold and unyielding. It felt like the entire bus had been encased in some kind of invisible prison, a prison with no walls, no bars, but a cage. Nonetheless, Marcus's panic deepened. He wasn't just trapped physically. It was something more than that. The longer he sat there, the more he felt it, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The air inside the bus grew heavier, as if the oxygen itself was being drained away. His thoughts started to slow, his mind clouding with the oppressive stillness. His sense of self began to fray, the sharp edges of his identity blurring like a painting left in the rain. He couldn't even remember what he had been thinking about before this. What had his life been like? Had he even had a life? The passengers around him still hadn't moved. The woman with the wild hair hadn't taken her eyes off him, her cold, dead stare following his every move. The man with the briefcase, his hands still tightly gripping it, hadn't even blinked. And the girl in the tattered dress, she hadn't moved either. No one spoke. No one did anything. And then a thought occurred to him, one so horrifying that it nearly stopped. His heart. What if they were all like him? What if they were all trapped here, stuck on this bus for eternity, just waiting for someone new to board, someone to take the journey with them, a new passenger, like him? The realization hit him like a flood. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had never been supposed to board this bus. This wasn't a bus. This was some kind of a vessel for souls. He could feel it now, deep in his bones, the wrongness of it, the twisted fate of it. It wasn't about transportation. It wasn't about a destination. It was about endurance, the endless journey, over and over again, taking new souls into the fold, one at a time. The idea churned in his stomach like sour milk. He could feel himself slipping, losing touch with reality. The world outside was gone. The world Inside, the bus was fading too. The faces around him blurred, became hazy, like they were melting into the walls. His mind struggled to hold on to the threads of his own identity, but it was slipping through his fingers. What had he been? Who had he been? He thought about the life he had left behind. What had it been? He tried to reach back, but there was nothing. It was like trying to grab hold of smoke. His memories were dissolving in front of him, and the more he tried to remember, the harder it became. The bus, the passengers, the road, stretching endlessly on. All of it was becoming his new reality, and he was becoming a part of it. The girl in the tattered dress was staring at him now, her eyes locked with his, wide and unblinking. It wasn't a look of pity. It was understanding. She knew. She knew what was happening. She had been here before, just like the others. Her lips parted slightly, and her voice came out in a whisper, so soft, so quiet, that it felt like a breeze brushing against his ear. "You're one of us now," she said. The words sank into him, like stones dropped into deep water. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. It was as if his throat had closed up, like his voice had been stolen. The woman in the front row smiled at him then. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't even a cruel one. It was simply knowing, empty, like she had seen it all before, like she had seen it happen 100 times, 1,000 times. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice hollow, as though it came from a place far away. Marcus tried to stand, to push past the sense of numbness that was creeping up on him, but it was too late. He could feel himself slipping further away from himself, his body, his thoughts, his very essence, blending with the bus, with the passengers, with the eternal ride. He wasn't meant to get off. Not now. Not ever. He sat back down in his seat, his hands trembling. His legs felt like they no longer belonged to him. The darkness outside had crept inside the bus, swallowing up everything, even the dim flicker of the lights. It wasn't just the road that had disappeared now. It was the world itself. The boundaries of reality had dissolved into the nothingness outside, leaving nothing behind. But this cursed journey, his chest tightened. It was happening. Slowly, inevitably, his mind was surrendering, accepting the truth he had refused to see. The bus continued to glide forward endlessly. The engine hummed like the heartbeat of the world itself, steady and unyielding. Marcus had been on this bus for what felt like a lifetime, and yet it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. The feeling of being trapped, of being stuck in this place between worlds, between life and death, between understanding and madness. There was no escape from it, no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, Marcus felt a shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The air grew heavier, as though the atmosphere itself had changed. The engine's hum became deeper, slower. The weight of it pressed against him like the earth itself had risen to crush him. He could hear the passengers around him now, their breathing, their soft murmurs, their slow, rhythmic exhalations. He felt his body begin to move slowly, without his command, as if it had a mind of its own. He was standing again, walking toward the front of the bus, his eyes fixed on the driver. The man in the gray suit hadn't moved, hadn't looked at him, but Marcus could feel him. He could feel the man's presence, his emptiness, his absence. There was no life in that man. He was just another shell, another passenger, waiting to disappear into the darkness. Marcus reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on the driver's seat. The man turned to look at him then, his hollow eyes boring into Marcus's soul. There was no recognition in his gaze, no warmth. There was only the cold, infinite knowledge of the bus, of the journey. "You'll never leave," the driver whispered. And Marcus understood then. He wasn't just trapped on the bus. He had become the bus. The endless cycle would continue. New passengers would board. They would sit and they would wait, just as Marcus had. But there would be no end, no final stop, only the ride, forever. Marcus's last thought was of freedom, but it faded quickly, swallowed up by the dark void outside. There was no freedom here. There was only the last stop, and Marcus had arrived.